Hello,
Hello.
everybody. And here we are with the next episode of the CMA panel. We have, William has just joined us. Thanks so much, Will. Welcome to the party. We are live, sir. So today we're here to discuss the Agile methodology, or as is affectionately known in the ServiceNow ecosystem, WAGILE. But we're going to discuss some of the do's, the don'ts, the things that we've seen that make it successful, some of the things we've seen that don't make it as successful as it could be, maybe share a war story or two. So, without further ado, we have Tej and we have Will with us. So, how are you both doing today?
Yeah, doing fantastic, Chris.
Yeah, doing great, Chris. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thanks for joining us. So let's just dive right in. And of course, if there are any questions, go ahead, type them into the chat, and we'll address them when they come up. But Will, what do you think are some of the key characteristics that you look for when you're setting up an agile practice?
Yeah, I think one of the things you have to look at is what kind of agile you're going to be doing. Right, there's so many different kinds. Whether you're going to be doing Scrum Agile, or you're going to be doing Safe Agile, or if you're going to be doing Kanban, which is kind of Agile-ish, and making sure that your organization, whatever organization you're working with, can actually support that kind of agile. And you called it WAGILE. I sometimes call it water fragile. Because it doesn't really sometimes people just can't move fast enough to do those kinds of things. So when you're planning your velocity and you're planning your sprint durations and looking at what your capacity for things are gonna be, that's a really important thing to note, because all of those different kinds of agile, they take a different kind of management and a different kind of planning up front for those things. And the other thing that I think I've found has been super helpful over the years is sitting down with our customers and sort of explaining what the agile landscape looks like. So make sure that we're on the same terms for the right vernacular, making sure that everyone understands what the ceremonies are going to be, so that they know what to expect throughout that agile process. Has been super helpful, because even though everyone says like, yeah, we do agile, and I'm not sure that means the same thing to everybody. So kind of just like level setting is super important there.
Yeah, I agree. Getting everybody on the same page is a huge milestone to reach just in your agile methodology implementation, because we've all jumped into those customers and oh yeah, we do agile, and it's like, well, you're doing stories, and that's
Right.
it. There's no epics, no themes, all of that kind of stuff. Tej, how about yourself? What are some of the characteristics you look for when you're setting up or starting out a new agile implementation?
Yeah, I think Will pretty much covered most of the important characteristics there. In complementary to that, I think it's more around communication and collaboration, making sure how often you communicate with the different stakeholders and also to your developers, right? I think that's an important characteristic, and setting up expectations or guidelines around that. The other piece is making or being aware of what the skill set of your team is, and assigning those different stories or the sprint cycles to those
Mhm.
particular teams and the developers. I think that's also another important aspect of it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that's a
agree.
good point, Tej. Actually, like, people kind of knowing what their role is I think a critical part of that process. Knowing who your Scrum Master is going to be, who's going to be your functional person, who's going to be your tester, who's going to be your developers on that, because all of that needs to work in concert to really be successful for Agile.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, well, let's move into a couple things that you've seen cause issues or slow down the agile process. So, Tej, we'll revisit you as well. So, what
Yeah.
are some real world things that you've seen happen or characteristics in an agile approach that have caused headaches or slowdowns?
Yeah. So, um, I think one example that I can think of is with Agile, we're trying to push releases like either 2 weeks or 3 week sprint cycles, right? We also have to look at the appetite of the customer. And especially we as consultants, when we are trying to implement or recommend Agile to our customers, first look at the lay of the land. Are they in a position where they are able to absorb all of those changes. And again, looking at two phases, during implementation and post implementation, right? I think that plays an important role as to where you are in implementing this agile. And if it is during implementation, also sometimes I've seen it cause issues where, let's say, the product owners or the process owners, as you continue to build these different requirements and you push it out to, let's say, the QA or UAT instance, then there's a lot of pushback. They are not ready for looking at those changes. So adopting early feedback, maybe doing build demos as you're developing them, showcasing it to your customers so that they're involved in that development process. That's actually key. But it goes back to the point to say, if we have inefficient cycles for agile, then it may not necessarily help the client in some cases. So that's one thing.
Yep.
And again, a resistance to change as well. We spoke about the teams that's not willing to maybe accept some of those, like, let's say, story points. We were talking about it, Chris. Like how, let's say, you have like story points, and if the team feels too much pressured and being able to keep up with that pace, that's something we'll need to look at. And
Mhm.
also, not everybody's familiar with agile. So I think it's making sure that the customer, as well as we as consultants, when we go into the implementations, drawing that fine line of what's the right balance is actually important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything you said there, and that there's a lot of culture points or culture things that you had raised, which really takes us into the next topic after we go to Will and say what were some of the things that you see that caused Agile to kind of be a little slower or even completely fail.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that we see that you really need to pay attention to when you're using an agile process. One is that when you're doing like your ceremonies, especially if you're doing scrums, if you're doing your daily scrum, keeping those scrums strictly to the 15-minute scrum interval of, hey, let's talk about what your impediments are. Let's talk about what your blockers are. What is it that we're going to be attacking today, so we know what our priorities are for the day. People have a tendency to use those meetings as like, let's do an architectural review, or let's talk about whatever other things come to our mind that we want to talk about, which really derails that meeting, which is supposed to be just setting the agenda for the day. I think making sure that you keep that in mind and keeping that meeting to what it is purely supposed to be, which is, hey, do you need anything? Is there anything in your way? Is there anything that I need to do to make sure that something is out of your way so that we can finish doing this sprint work here? That's really important. Anything else, you should take to a different meeting. That because those meetings will get dragged down, and then you'll have more meetings about that meeting, and you have more meetings about those meetings, and that just slows everything down. But you don't have to do all those things in that meeting, right? You can continuously communicate throughout the process, which is super important for Agile because everything is working fluidly in motion at the same time. You're developing, you're iterating, you're testing, you're deploying. All of those things are happening at the same time. So that communication needs to be really free flowing, which is the other part of it. When people aren't communicating, or they're waiting for meetings, or they're just waiting for like whatever the next step is, and they're not saying, hey, this is ready for you, or can you check this out, or can we go through our stories? Can we make sure that our test cases are aligned to our use cases, are aligned to our development criteria and our acceptance criteria? Like those things all streamline that activity process for Agile. And any one of those gets a hitch in it and it slows things down. The other part of that is, I think Tej mentioned it with like the deployment process. Agile traditionally is you're doing 2-week sprints, and at the end of that 2-week sprints, you're deploying something so that they can see like whatever the capability is. Now, I work a lot with the U.S. federal government, and they just cannot move that fast. If I were deploying something every 2 weeks, there's no way their head would fall off. So when we look at that, we have to make sure that we're setting the expectation for, okay, we're going to do a 2-week development iteration. After that, we're going to go through our QA and code review and our change management process to be able to deploy this into the next set. And then you'll be able to see it. Here's when you'll be able to see the outcome. Are you able to see what we have from a development standpoint in your sub-production instances, but it's going to hit prod in the preceding sprint. So your users are going to be there, and that gives you a chance to incorporate things like organizational change management outside of just your IT change management processes, so that there's no surprises and people know what's coming. Because that is, all of those things will help accelerate your deployments, but also help prevent that failure that comes with Agile if people aren't ready for the things that are coming, right? We talk about that a lot, especially as CMAs. We talk about OCM a lot. And that OCM component is really critical in Agile because things are moving so fast.
Yes, I mean that's a ton of great information. So we'll kind of now move towards discussing maybe a great agile implementation that we've worked with, and I've already got one locked and loaded. This was back several years ago when I was a developer, and this was a large team, and they had a phenomenal project manager, and she was also an excellent scrum master, perhaps one of the best I've worked with. And we had a lot of people said, oh, it's all meetings, agile's all meetings. And this, we had every sprint was 2 weeks, and the Monday of the sprint we had a 90-minute entire meeting of a team of about 70 people, and we had daily sprints, and with 70 people optional on those scrum meetings, we got through them always in 15 minutes or less, sometimes as low as 3. I think that was the record. And then here's the one piece that I always find people miss out on, is that last meeting on the end of the sprint, the retrospective. So we would do that on the Friday before it moved over to production. So they had all the meetings, everything was run very smoothly, and she had what she called the art of the polite interruption. So that is what kept everything moving forward. Because, like you said, Will, a lot of times it turns into, well, hey, can you look at this code? Like, let me just share my screen for all 80 people. That never happened. She's like, nope, offline meeting, please. And that was those purposes of those scrums, was to, like you said, set up what the day's focus is. And just because if I'm asking Will a question, doesn't mean that Tej might not have the answer. And that's what the beauty of those scrum meetings is, that sometimes I would be asking help of someone and someone else says, oh, I already did that. Let's meet. And then suddenly we had that instant connection. We would go and have that offline meeting and move forward on the day. So that was the dream implementation. I've only seen one other customer I've worked with do it just as well, and they had a very similar approach. One other characteristic that they had, and we had talked about this before we went live, Tej, was that they had this philosophy of, we want to overload everybody. So everybody had 3 weeks of work in their 2-week sprint, but the culture, I know you're shaking your head, Will, but let me tell you what they had. The culture was that there was never a problem if you push something to another sprint. And management, leadership, the executives, everybody bought into that. And I pushed stuff all the time as long as I had a reason. Oh, I had this meeting, or somebody's gone, or I just didn't get to it because I got these other things done. Everybody felt that was okay. And what the offshoot or the end result was, that everybody had something to do. Like you had said, well, there was a bit of idle time in yours. I never had idle time.
Oh, that idle time thing, that backlog management and that backlog grooming is super important, right? Because that really prioritizes all the work that you're doing. It's not so much about idle time, it's the jerkiness of the transitions between what you're doing from a development, testing, and a release iteration piece, right? Because as you're going through, you've got to validate your stories, you've got to validate the criteria that goes with those things, and then you've got to get to your development team, and then you've got to get to your QA team and all those things. So it's like, if those guys aren't in tune with each other, it's a very jerky process. It sounds like yours was very smooth. Yeah. Now, I've been on projects where it was very smooth, and the team just, they were just gel, and it was amazing to watch. Yeah.
Well, it's nice to hear you had a couple of same experiences. Tej, how about yourself?
I was going to say, another thing to consider, which I think sometimes we forget, is to factor in time for building out ATFs as well, especially if you're especially if you're a customer that's actually embracing ATF and or actively utilizing it. There's a ton of value that I see, especially during the upgrade. It's so much more easier, and especially when you're launching anything new, it's um, it's very easy to run the run of the mill, get through the ATF tests and get a sense of what's breaking. But at the same time, if the ATF test cases are quite complex, then that's where we see a lot of developers spending a whole lot of time just fixing the existing ATFs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm down the ATF train just recently again, and I'll admit something. I just bake it in and do it. So I'll build something, and then I'll build the ATF, and then there it is. It just appears. And the reason I've started to do this, and even without asking, hey, can we allocate time for it, is because it ends up saving me time as the implementer on my unit testing.
Totally.
Right.
So that has been, one of those things is like, why didn't I start doing this from the start? And now I'm just baking it in to it. So if you're not using ATFs, use them. And as you mature it, you're always going to make that time back. Like if it takes you 4 hours to manually test something and you have to do it 3 or 4 times and it takes you 10 hours to then do an ATF, the fourth time you run that test is when you're starting to print money or you're printing value, I guess would be the better way to phrase it. And scheduling them before and after patches, clones, upgrades, all of that stuff is going to show that value and keep your auditors happy. You can link it to change request. Like there's just so many things that you can do with it. How do you, let's sidebar a bit, Will, and have you worked with anybody that does ATFs quite well?
So our teams do ATF really, really well, and we make it a point to incorporate that into our development, configuration, and deployment processes for our DevOps, DevSecOps lifecycle and those things, because it does accelerate everything that we're doing. Right? If you're manually testing things, if you're going through test scripts and you have to manually do those things, it takes more time than just having ATF do it. So having having the automation with those tests saves you a ton of time. Now you can't test everything with ATF, unfortunately. I wish you could, honestly,
Yeah.
but the bulk of the things that we're doing, you can use that, and it works out really well. It's interesting that earlier you also mentioned like the sprint retro, and I think the milestones, the kickoff and the retro on both sides of the sprint, I think play into those things, because then if you're building in time for things like ATF and to build those tests into your stories, like that's where you can cheat it a little bit as a PM or a Scrum Master. I mean, it's like, I hate to say that because that's giving away some of my secret sauce there. I'm like, I can get
Yeah.
ahead of the sprint by having these things sort of preloaded, ready to go into the next sprint. But it does help us increase our velocity as we move through that, and that's what we want to do. I mean, especially in a Scrum lifecycle, you always want to be ready to move to the next iteration, and knowing what your backlog is, like we were talking about, having those ATFs already there and baking those things in so that it's really just happening. Like it's just happening, that it really speeds things up, because velocity in Agile is going to be everything, right? Your velocity and capacity are going to be the things that are driving everything you do.
Now, you both have covered a lot of stuff around Agile as the implementation strategy. How do you factor Agile into the operational side of things? Like we've said, ATFs, because you can rerun them, before your patches and upgrades, and afterwards validating existing work. It's important, like you said, Will, to have an ATF candidate strategy or guidelines, almost like ATF technical governance,
Yeah.
maybe a decision making framework, which I've implemented a bit at one partner as well. So, how do you handle Agile and the operational side of things, Tej?
Yeah, I think the important thing to have is maybe a release manager. That's actually quite important. And especially if you're making sure that you're running operations, having a release manager and walking through all of your release cycles, and also outlining the business outcomes. That's something that I've started to advocate my team recently, that as you're building out these stories and you're mapping them out to releases, let's start documenting the business benefits and business value on that as
Mhm.
well, so that when it goes through the change cycle, the customer is able to see the business benefits. They're able to see the validation that comes with ATF, as a testimony to what has been developed, and making sure that nothing is breaking. And then the cycle time for approvals is much quicker, because they are able to see all of this on the change, when it's going through that cycle.
Yeah, so that business value you're finding is adding a little bit of approval pressure to the approvers so that they really want to get it into production as soon as they can to start
Yeah.
realizing that value. So okay, so it's helping drive those approval decisions and shortening those timelines.
Yeah,
That's
much faster, because every time, you'll get less challenged explaining why you're doing it. I think especially when you have multiple businesses involved, and it's
mhm.
just the technology business that's driving all of these initiatives, and sometimes the business users go like, I don't know what I'm going to get out of this, right? So being able to explain that is something that to keep in mind on the operational side. And we've also done something called as version control. So on the employee center, we created a nice little widget, just like announcements, that talks about what has been deployed and how can you benefit from it. I think being able to do that is quite significant. And I was able to, originally do that back in the day when I was working for GE. We did that quite often. And I think that's something that resonated with me, that I advocate for all the other customers as well.
Nice. You'd mentioned the release manager. Can you cover a bit of their responsibilities and the reason why we would want to have that person on the project? And we're talking a large project here, and if you're on a smaller one, we do have that topic coming up as well. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think you want to have one person that kind of navigates or steers the ship, if you would say, being able to follow the best practices and guidelines, and also making sure that you have a set number of stories going into a particular release. Sometimes, you do have the product owner that is doing it, but you would rather want the product owner to be focused on much bigger um, ideas and areas. Then it's best to have release managers just focus on this particular area, just to make sure that your deployments are getting into production without any issues.
Nice. So they're kind of taking the baton once it's cleared UAT and then handing it off and taking the change management process
Yeah,
from there.
100%.
Okay, Will, you'd also mentioned earlier a lot about the handoff piece or like passing the baton. What do you recommend to implement within the whole Agile enterprise or the Agile implementation that you're using to be successful at those handoffs?
Look, you mentioned it pretty briefly earlier, but when you said the word governance, right? That governance structure is critical. It's critical for everything you're going to do, but specifically when you're transitioning to operations and maintenance and that O&M life cycle that's in there, because that's really going to drive not only what it is those teams are doing, but how they're doing it, and then where does that re-enter the development life cycle on those things. So implementing that governance life cycle to be able to define whose responsibility is where. We talk about the strategic layers of governance, and we've got that strategic layer, the programmatic level, and the tactical level. Those things are like the rules of the road for everybody that's going in there, and that's going to really set the tone for what everyone's going to do. Because when you get into that operational state, that's where you have to make sure that your O&M team they know what they're supposed to do. It's break fix, it's minor enhancements, and anything beyond a certain point needs to go back to the dev team, but it's got to go through the change request process and like whatever that's going to be. But also your intake into things, like how are you sorting those? How are you prioritizing those? How are you making sure that this is even the right approach, right? For us, we work in pretty large environments that have multiple platforms, ServiceNow being one of them. People come up with these crazy ideas, and we're like, okay, how do we know that this is a ServiceNow idea?
Mhm.
So we've got to filter it through those things to get through the process and hand off to O&M. So
Okay.
that governance is it, man. That's the jam.
Yeah. So the demand governance side of things, it sounds like you're talking about. Would all of
Absolutely.
that fall
Yeah.
under demand? Okay.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm just agreeing
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's kind of shift gears again a little bit here. And, it's kind of in spirit of Agile is changing gears often. And sometimes you're working with a small team. Maybe it's even 3 people. And I'm currently engaged doing that with a team of 3 people and one director who does the change request approval piece. But how do small teams use Agile best?
Hmm.
Tej? Or is that?
Yeah, I think it really depends on how much backlog you have ongoing, right? Back to the point that I was pointing out initially, right? It depends. If you're doing an implementation, it makes sense. You have enough story points or backlog or just the nature of the implementation itself, right? You have so many things to develop. But post implementation, if you're really small customer, you don't have that many demands initially coming in. And that happens, right? The first 6 months, usually people are taking time to adopt the platform and trying to get into the platform and get familiar with it. So during that time, you may not have a whole lot of demand, but once your business users are able to understand what ServiceNow is able to do, then you'll start seeing all of those ideas and demands starts flowing in. So I think that needs to be determined based on how much of backlog you're actually receiving, and that can be flexible. I wouldn't say, or it's not like a set in stone kind of a mechanism where you have to develop and deploy something in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It, I would say, just look at your backlog, especially if you're a small team.
Yeah. How about yourself, Will? Any
Yeah.
advice for the small teams out there?
No, I agree with that. I think your backlog is really going to be your constraint, especially with a small team, because if you're running 3 people, that means that you only have so much capacity to do things. So
Right.
making sure that you're not over allocating yourself or over committing in any sprint. I mean, it's okay. Like if you're cool with pushing stuff to the right, and that is totally an acceptable approach in practice, but you probably don't want to make it so that you're committing to 80 stories and you're completing 15. Right? That's a
Right.
ridiculous proposition. So managing your backlog and understanding your team's capacity is really important with small teams.
Yeah, I agree. Another element that I like to put in is that I will rarely give you, as the client, a production release date until the change request is approved. And I've faced significant pushback in that. But once people realize that it is so much out of my hands, I can't control UAT sign off. I've been in those things where everybody agreed on all the stories, all the requirements. They loved all the demos. And now we hand it off to UAT and we have to tear it down and rebuild it. And that's okay. Agile's built to handle that pump the brakes at the last second situation, and that's why it exists. Actually, I think is just frustrated devs at the end of that going, okay, let's start over, and that's fine, right? But that's why I've really started to shift into saying I will give you the ETA on the next step. I will have a demo if the next step is requirements gathering. I'll have the stories written by the end of this week, or I'll have a demo for you by the end of the month. We will be ready to hand it off to UAT by the end of this sprint. And then, once it's approved and changed, then I'll give you a production release date. And this is given a lot of understanding around all of the steps in the software development lifecycle. The business, in this one example, understands it much better, and they're able to plan and fit that into the organizational change management piece. So now they know, and we kind of settled into this rhythm where once it has cleared UAT, they start doing their OCM and their communication strategy. How are we going to do it? They have to do a translation piece with it as well, so it takes a little while to do it, but that has ensured that nobody feels like, oh, well, I missed a deadline, and everything's accurate, and they all are part of it as the step of the way. So their expectations are managed everywhere, which is nice. And like you said, Will, sometimes you have to push it, and as long as you have a good reason for it, I found everybody to be quite understanding of that. How does house cleaning fit into your plans? Like, could you imagine if I like to say, can we do 1 month of nothing but bug fixes and clean up? And I've got a couple clients that agree to that because they see the business value, but I had to make like quite the compelling case for it because everybody wants, I want new stuff. I want something new in the,
Of course.
you know, but to say, okay, if you give me a month of house cleaning every year, I can get you 2 extra months worth of implementation put into production because I'm taking your car in for a tune-up. You're going to get better gas mileage and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. So
Wouldn't
how
it
does
be
house
dope
cleaning fit
to
in?
have that month though? Just like I'm going to sit down and do bug fixes and clean up on everything. But the car tune-up is probably a good example because you're taking it in to get a tune-up and an oil change, but you still have to go to work the next day, so you have to do it in between those things.
That's fair. Okay, so you fit it in between incrementally.
We have to.
Yeah.
For me, anyways, I have to because
Yeah.
we have to continue to develop new features and functionality.
Okay.
The things that we have in our backlog, and of course, bug fixes, break fixes, they come in. We prioritize them. Like it's something that's really depending on what the prioritization is on those things, the impact, and we prioritize it from there. So
Okay.
if it's breaking stuff, then we've got to fix it.
Yes. Yeah. The house cleaning element would not be ignoring something that is a bug or causing a negative. Yeah, it is code cleanup. It's
Right.
aligning things to the best standards or the latest leading practices. And
Are you
things
saying
along
that you're
those
not
lines.
doing that as you're going through the development process?
But you go back afterwards.
You just admit to not following best practices
Oh,
and having to go back and clean that up.
You're welcome to go and ask virtually every developer I've worked with to see like what's it like to pass a Chris code assessment or a code review.
I am.
I know that's funny though. It's more of aligning. I guess when I look back on some things I've done 2 years ago, I'm like, oh, I'd redo it. I just completely redid an entire application to unify a script include and to make either some functions in there that just ended up being things that did more than one item.
Or new stuff
did one.
comes out, right? The platform has
Yeah.
functionality and new things
Totally.
happen, and
Yeah.
you want to be able to take advantage of the new features and functionality in the platform.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
that happens every release.
Yeah, that's true. And
So-
every patch now.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Touch.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so one of the things that I do is, if the customer doesn't really have much of backlog going on, make sure that at least you're staying on the current release. And it happens once in 6 months. It comes with a lot of features and capabilities. And one of the things that a lot of customers miss on is you do get when you're purchasing all of these licenses with ServiceNow, whether it's ITSM, ITOM, or SPM. You do have quite a bit of capabilities that's built in that you often fail to leverage. So start taking a look at some of those capabilities. It could be, going back to your housekeeping or house cleaning, right? Instant scan. That's a feature that's very underrated. I think a lot of things can be done, and just being able to like look at your logs and come up with some principles on how do you set some standards around your development. So that can be set with an instant scan, and that those can be run frequently, or doing a yearly health check. I believe every customer is entitled to get a yearly health check for free. So
Okay.
we can take a look at those recommendations and see how we can best adopt some of those.
And that's the health scan, right? The
Yeah, the
instance
health
health scan that ServiceNow runs. Okay, just want
That's
to make
correct.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you do have to request it. I think as partners we could do it before, but now I think you have to go to the ServiceNow account executive and get it done. So the other thing we can also look at is I think we've already spoken about tie it into a continuous improvement model, right? Like we are going to have, let's say, X number of features that comes with a certain release. Do we have the appetite to adopt all of those features in the next 6 months? If not, let's revisit that in the next 6 months and then come back. And when we have more bandwidth from our teams to be able to develop those capabilities, let's do that. Or even you can look at maybe doing automation with your foundation data, right? A lot of times with normalization you have most of your foundation data managed, but still you'll have things like, I want to change group memberships, or let's say resetting passwords and so on. Those things are really easy to set up. Like all you have to do is set up an integration with AD to enable that automation. Previously it was called orchestration. So those are the things that, like, your low hanging fruits, right? You can quickly set up and get value out of it. So yeah, I mean, there's always something in the ServiceNow world that you can always develop and keep yourself um, enabled for more transformation.
Right, and that's a great way to build a backlog if you don't have one.
Right.
You go off and look, what am I paying for that I'm not leveraging? And I'm working with a client right now, and they want to start doing problem, but we kind of found out that we need to revamp the change approval piece first. So now, every time you kind of look under the hood, you're like, okay, well, I want to do that, but in order to get to that part of the engine, sorry, my dad's a retired mechanic, so I do a lot of car analogies. But in order to get to that part of the engine, I got to go over here and do this first, right? And that was also reminds me of my childhood a lot, because I love the RPGs, like the original Final Fantasies and stuff like that. And it was always like, okay, I want to go do this, but I got to go do these 5 other things first so that I can do it. So that's great to bring up. Let's address, though, kind of a common misconception. Let's talk about story points and their original intent. Yeah, I saw your face, Will. Let's talk about their original intent, how no one does it like that, and how do we handle that with all of our clients, because everyone seems to do it a little differently or a lot differently.
Right. Yeah, I think story points. It's a gray area unless you set expectations around what it actually means. So even I, during my early days of development, I thought one story point equals 1 hour. So and I'm like,
Yeah.
so I used to work in that, but then I got overwhelmed with the amount of work that I was doing, and eventually someone told me, it's actually, this is what we are following. So one story point equals 8 hours. And then when I start looking into like more of the details, right? It's important. So setting that expectations early on with your teams, that this is how we are going to structure it. These are the number of story points that we're going to target for each release cycle. That's actually key. And making sure that everybody understands as well, right? Because sometimes factor in all of the other elements that goes into development. Because when you look at story points, it's not just about development. You also have to factor in unit testing and making sure that you have adequate time, maybe for ATF as well, right? So, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Oh man, I can't imagine seeing one story point and going, that took me 8 hours. Like I would be,
Yeah.
even now, freaking out. Like, I am terrible, and maybe I should rethink my career. So yeah, that's a communication point, and that onboarding is so crucial, so that you don't have somebody sitting there feeling like they take 8 times as long as someone else, right? 'Cause
Right.
sometimes it's hard to bring your head up and ask that question and go, hey, like, is this really the thing? And like you said, 1 point was truly 8 hours, so it looks like they're using points for days, like to represent one day. So like 3 points would be 3 days, whereas most of our experience is 1 point equals 1 hour. So Will, how do you feel about story points?
Yeah. So, story points are an interesting thing because they mean different things to different people. Sometimes it's like, oh, this story point is worth 8 hours, or this is an hour. But I think story points traditionally were meant to measure like the complexity of the thing that you're doing, not just the unit of time that it would take to do it, right? The complexity dictates time, but story points are supposed to be like, this is a more hard thing to do. This is an easier thing to do. But that's not how we do it now. We look at story points in terms of units of time, so that when we get there, we're like, oh, it's 44 story points, so that must be 44 hours worth of work, which isn't necessarily true, because you can have one story point assign something, and some people are like, that's 8 hours, and you're like, that's not 8 hours, that's like 45 minutes, or
Yeah.
that's 2 hours, but it's just like, I have to do the thing. It's not that complicated. We're just doing a business rule or a UI action or something, or whatever it's going to be. Whereas if you're doing a more complex thing, story points can be higher based on the complexity of that. If you're doing some integration, a JSON load, or something like that that requires more work around it, those things would be a higher level of story point, but doesn't necessarily translate to a set of hours until you get into that, which is why it's important that when you're doing your points poker or you're doing your story point assessment and your sprints, that part of that is understanding the complexity of the work that you're pulling out of the backlog and then doing those estimates on top of that, because the estimation is probably the hardest part of everything that you're going to do, because everyone always wants to know, well, how long is that going to take? You're like, well, give me a minute. Let me figure out what the thing is that we're actually doing. And you don't really know that until you get the story flushed out a little bit, and then you can get there. So story points they're weird, man. Like, it's hard to deal with that sometimes, but it is a constant setting of expectations of having some kind of standard on what story points are supposed to be and how to use them. Because people that know Agile or say they know Agile and they're like, yeah, that's one story point, that's 8 hours. And you're like, no, that's not how we're going to do it.
Well, and I'm fine. I'm always asking those clarification questions. So is that 8 hours of dev time, or are you factoring in the QA? Are you factoring change, right? Because or we do everything by hours, and you see like 2 story points. I'm like, well, it's 4 hours to do change management. So you already were failing and not going to meet that. How do you guys leverage the Agile Development 2.0 module in the platform? I know that it's kind of, would you say recently been kind of opened up so that anybody can use it as long as you have an existing subscription, but how do you leverage it?
I was wondering when we were going to get to that, because I think we're all implying that we would use ServiceNow for Agile development, but we never explicitly said that in any of our conversation. I like using our Agile stories. I like using Agile and ServiceNow to do our work. And the reason I really like it is because it ties together with all of the other things that we need to do through the change management process. So when we're tying our stories to specific releases and to the change management of the changes, the change requests or incidents or whatever that we're putting through those things, like, it makes it really easy to do that stuff. Plus, the demand intake process, you can go from demand to a project to stories to changes and all those things. Like, that's really, really nice to have all in one place. I was gonna make a joke and be like, I don't even do that. I use Jira, but like, I don't. I hate Jira. If I could not use Jira, that would be great. But like, a lot of people use Jira, so we have to use it in conjunction with what we're doing. And we prefer to use the ServiceNow Agile module. Now, the nice thing is that you can actually use both, right? You can use Jira and you can use the Agile module. You can integrate the two and bring those stories across. It's a little bit challenging to make sure that you're managing on both sides, but you can do it. But I like it. All right. I think that module specifically, it captures a lot of the stuff to help drive for, like, if you're not an Agile pro, it gives you the recipe for the things you should be asking.
That's right. Yes. And that guidance and the kind of the guardrails so that you don't get too far off the path. You still can, but too far. Tej, how about yourself? How do you use the Agile module in ServiceNow?
Yeah, I think pretty much Will covered most of it, Chris. So the only other point that I think has gotten better over a period of time is defect management. I think previously it wasn't that great, in terms of, how do you track defects and pointing it back to the stories. And also, one of the things that we have done is associating that back to the ATM as well, so that you're able to completely test end to end. And let's say you're fixing the bugs, you also have a place where you're associating that test suite, and so that it successfully passes. So as you're closing out on these defects, it's much more easier for you to track. And of course, Jira integration. That is a lot of customers do think Jira is a much better place to track.
Pro tip: it's not.
I mean, it does have some advantages for sure, but I think what it doesn't have that ServiceNow does have is that connection to everything else, and that is the better together story that I've used to successfully say, all right, We do it in we track everything in ServiceNow stories because I can have enhancements and defects exposed to the business. They can submit their things. I can come in and create all the stories that I need to implement. Your dev team can go implement it, and then they can reference an existing record in their change management process, or they can bundle it all into a group release, and you can have that unified view without having to log into two different places. That alone, I'm like, how do you like logging into five different places to get all of that information? You know,
It
I don't
doesn't.
want. I go to project for this. I go, Jira for that, and I go to ServiceNow for this place, and I got to go to SAP over here to enter my time. Like, can we just not all go one
Yeah,
to
but
one
that's the
place?
thing, Chris.
And yeah,
But most of the customers, right? If especially if they are heavily reliant on SAP, if they are in SAP shop,
mhm.
then they are more inclined towards using Jira. And
Yes,
yes, you can talk a lot about ServiceNow and everything else, but
mhm.
eventually they'll be like, yeah, man, all my developers, all my team, for the rest of the enterprise, they are most familiar and comfortable with Jira.
Right.
We want to leverage.
Well, that's actually great because that brings me to my next question for you both: is how do you get those other teams to go? I'm in Azure DevOps, and I'm in SAP, and I'm in Jira. How do you get them to use Agile in the ServiceNow instance?
Well, in my experience,
No,
it's a
what I
difficult topic
it
right now
is.
because I have tried and I've failed. I don't think I've
Hmm.
succeeded
Okay,
in making sure that other teams also use ServiceNow because
right.
they have all of their let's say they have Git repositories and other places where they
Hmm.
push out code, and all of that is really well integrated with Jira.
Right.
So yeah, they don't want to come out of their comfort zone and adopt
Hmm.
something fairly new. And it also goes back to the point that right now we have SAP ECC and most customers migrating to S4 HANA.
Hmm.
That is more cloud based, and I think it's gotten much better, right? But ServiceNow is fairly new for some of the customers adopting that. They were an SAP shop before, and now they're looking at ServiceNow. So it becomes difficult to make that justification. Well, that's my experience, Chris.
Yep, and that's fair. How about yourself, Will? How do you get other teams to use the Agile module in ServiceNow?
Yeah, it's tricky because a lot of times we're dealing with multiple parts of an organization, and they usually all have their own tool that they're managing things in, whether it's
Hmm.
Jira or it's Remedy or it's whatever.
Yeah.
Um, Forcing people to put it all in one place never goes well, right? Like, you must use this tool. They're like, why? I
Right.
use this one. Why don't you use mine? And then we'll be good. Um, so it becomes a little bit of a compromise in terms of working with the environment that you're in and
Hmm.
making sure that everyone's kind of sharing those things. The nice, like I mentioned earlier, right? You can integrate those things so that you can create that holistic view. I think that's probably usually the better answer is we can share.
Hmm.
Like, I'll share my stuff, you share your stuff, and then we'll just live our life in our separate houses. Uh,
Yeah.
but it's a little it's tricky. It's tricky to force people to go to one system unless you start there, right? If you start
Right.
there, that's a lot easier to run with.
Well, you kind of gave earlier. You said you kind of gave away some of the secret sauce. So I'll
Yeah.
kind of do a bit of the same. Is the strategy I like to use is let's just become the system of record in ServiceNow only to support change. So this assumes you're already doing change management in ServiceNow, and I'll integrate into Azure DevOps. I will integrate into Jira. Just give me the info, and then I'm going to make your change management. I'll reduce your effort there, and I'll make it easier and smoother for you to get your changes approved. Oh, okay, because I'm solving a pain point problem. Little do some of them know is that the next step in that strategy is the common ServiceNow system of record first, then system of engagement second. So I'll flesh out a CSDM solution that encapsulates all of the business capabilities and everything that's used to deliver it. And then I will show that to leadership and go, hey, how much does that one cost? How much does this one cost? Because they all cost more than Agile at this point. And then it's a easy business case to do the tool consolidation project and move forward from there.
If
That
you say
does require a long journey. Well, it's an easy sell. It's an easier sell, right? I mean, we all sometimes hear, "Oh, ServiceNow is expensive," or things, and it is, but I think it's worth every penny when you implement it correctly. Another pain point that I've heard is that it costs a lot to change in SAP, right?
Yeah.
A recent example was that a VP was saying it costs him $50,000 just to wiggle a finger. I'm like,
Wow.
oh, okay, well, it looks like you're doing this approval process there.
They're
I
using the
can
Oracle
get
model.
that. I can, yeah. I said I can get that change cost of change in ServiceNow if you implement that approval process in ServiceNow down to measures of hundreds or 1,000 or and then suddenly it's like ears perk up and it's like, okay, well, let me see that, and then it's off to the races from there. So those longer strategies do help. But when it comes to the OCM or the organizational change management piece, I also try to bring in the people that are using it. So if we go way back, this is like early 2000s, I'm a help desk technician. And when they come in and bring a new tool, and here you go, everybody uses this, and nobody really the people that come in and implement it don't do it. They're not the day to day ones. Having those people provide feedback brings them into the project a bit better, and you'll learn more about how to implement it in a successful way that meets those needs of those who are going to use it. Okay, I think we're pretty much at the end.
Mhm.
Were there any topics or anything that you didn't want to, or that we didn't touch on that you wanted to address?
Yeah, I just think one note was I think we discussed it before, Chris, that I think release management is being deprecated in the Xanadu release, and there's going to be a new module, or it's already there. It's the digital product release. I think it has a much
Mm-hmm.
more streamlined way of managing all of your releases. Being able to associate with your different products or applications, and then managing that entire life cycle of that release. And even I think artifacts, being able to associate or attach the artifacts with that release, and
Mm-hmm.
release planning, all of that we had to customize for a few customers based on their business case. But I think really looking forward to that digital product release. I believe it came up in Xanadu release, and ServiceNow, I think, is no longer supporting it,
Mm-hmm.
and
Okay.
they might eventually come up with a way for all the customers to migrate into it.
Yeah, those migration tools on the deprecations have been a big saving grace. Remember reports and dashboards, and now it's all going to platform analytics. There was one I think a couple of years back that really helped out. Where you basically just installed the tool, ran it, and it moved everything over. And the 3 or 4 things it couldn't move over, you could then lift and shift yourself. So yes, release management is being deprecated. And there are strategies. You can reach out to Tej at Fujitsu for help on that, or Will at it's AFS, right? Will?
Yeah.
Yeah, for help on that as well. I'm sure you've gone through a lot of the deprecation management pieces, and you can track how you're going to do that in the Agile module in
Yeah.
ServiceNow. So, Will, was there anything that we wanted to discuss that we missed on
I
your
don't, I don't want to go super deep into it, but I would just say that your Agile and your releases and the things that you're doing can tie to your CSDM framework. Make sure that you're tying those things into that, because you'll be able to track and manage your data model across your platform much, much better.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, and it speaks more to the connection within ServiceNow and
Mm-hmm.
those record relationships. So, like I had said, we kind of support change, and we have a CSDM model, and it is all implemented, and you can see everything. And now, no matter how we go into the CMDB from different vantage points, executives can see from the capability level, technical people can see from the application service level. You can see how everything's related, how it's all connected. And then when they look at a CI, we've got some specific reports that you can look at to say, oh, well, how many
Yeah.
incidents were created from a change request? And does that change request have a story and an enhancement? And one of the things that it really helped us backtrack was an enhancement that kind of broke existing functionality on a business rule. We were able to go, okay, well, this incident came in, they tied it to this change request, which was these 3 enhancements. Oh, now we know that if we do this one piece, it's going to break this other area. So we had completely no visibility into that test case. And it was one of those ones that comes up, every 6 months, but we were able to figure out what the root cause was faster because of those connections. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Tej, thank you, Will, for another episode of the CMA panel for the Americas edition. I'm actually talking to some of the other people in the other parts of the world, so you may see me up late doing another one for EMEA, hopefully soon. Okay, thanks a lot. Feel free to reach out to Will or Tej through LinkedIn. Is that fair, gentlemen?
Yes.
Perfect.
Reach out for a connection request, and have a great day. Have an enjoyable